This is going to be a very tough topic for me this week. It actually took me several days to prepare for this episode because of the topic matter. In the last 6 years or so, I've been making a concerted effort to educate myself more about history, not just American history, but world history, and the ways that different events have played into each other and influenced not just literature, but the way we live today. And as I've been doing that, you come across a lot of things that you kind of wish you never learned, because I think each of us has this sort of fantasy of the past that we hold on to, and some of that is just certain truths that we've chosen to focus on when we think about the past, but other times it's things that we do not know very much about, or things that we've grown up knowing and haven't actually spent much time researching or reading about because we feel like we've known it all our lives. And sometimes we learn some very unpleasant things about things we thought we knew well. And then we have to sit down and think about how we're going to process that and what does that mean for us today. Why study history at all? Well, for me, the first reason, of course, is the one I just mentioned. I'm trying to find truth instead of legend, because even though legends and myths are easier to find inspiration from, I think it's important to find truth as well. And though I like fiction for those legends that help motivate me to press on and do good things, I look for truth to tell me which direction to go and how to properly look at the present in terms of the past. The second reason that I like to study history is not to condemn people or to try to find any kind of revenge upon the bad things that have happened in the past or the bad people who have committed them, but it teaches me something about myself and about my country and just human nature, the human race as a whole. That's how I view history. I don't try to divide it up, even though I do that to some extent, both consciously and subconsciously. I also try to view history as sort of an overall narrative of human history. So that is what I base my study of history on. I had known for some time now that in World War II, the Nazis had conducted experiments on human beings. In particular, most famous was the so-called Nazi doctor named Josef Mengele, who was famous for experimenting on twin children, and his experiments were truly horrific and do not deserve to be called science. They were very cruel experiments. I had heard also that something like that had happened in Japan. I did not know in great detail what that involved. So when I came across this book called The Sea and Poison by a Japanese author, Shūsaku Endō, I thought I would read it, and in spite of its heavy topic matter, I felt like now was a good time. The fact that it's written by a Japanese author gives you a different perspective than, say, a Western author. Here's someone writing about something that his own country did. Not only that, but it was published in 1958, so not very long after World War II. Ironically, from what I've found online, it was sometime after that before the Allied side would learn about these atrocities, and I'm going to go into that a bit more at the end of this episode, but I just wanted to preface this with that information so you get an understanding of where I'm coming from and the reason I chose to read this book. So what kind of person was Shūsaku Endō, and why did he choose to write about something that was, in a very national sense, personal to him? So I did a little research and learned a few things about him that I think are essential for understanding The Sea and Poison. Shūsaku Endō was born in Tokyo in 1923, so he was a young man when World War II started. The second thing you should know about him is that, unlike many other authors, writing was his first career. He actually started writing at a pretty young age and was published as well. And he became known later on as an author of the third generation. And the third generation was the leading group of Japanese writers who were prominent between 1953 and 1955, sort of that post-war era, and a time when World War II was figuring quite heavily in many works of literature, not just Japanese, but of course Hemingway and others. The third thing you should know about Shūsaku Endō, and probably the one thing most people do know about him who have heard of him, is that he is considered to be a Japanese Catholic author because he was baptized as a Catholic when he was a child. A number of his books feature Christianity and sort of the themes of how Christianity arrived in Japan and how it pertained to Japanese culture. Endo's most famous work is actually a novel called Silence. This novel is somewhat controversial. It's about a Jesuit missionary to Japan who renounces his faith under extreme pressure. I have not read that book. It was certainly the first one I'd heard of by Endō, but for this particular author, I decided to read The Sea and Poison first. There's two reasons for that. I usually tend to choose books from authors who are new to me. I usually tend to choose books that sound the most interesting to me, even if they're not the most famous. So for example, with Nathaniel Hawthorne, I chose to read a book called Fanshawe first, even though Fanshawe is not nearly as famous as The Scarlet Letter. And I did that because I think I will be able to appreciate the author more if I start with a book where the subject matter draws me in from the beginning. The second reason that I wanted to read The Sea and Poison first is because I already knew somewhat vaguely about this subject matter, Japanese biological experimentation on humans, and I was curious how Endō would handle the progression of evil in these characters. I've never really read a lot of books that do that. I know that Dostoevsky does that a little bit with Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, but I didn't find that to be extremely compelling when I first tried to read it. And I think Conrad does that a bit in Heart of Darkness. But still, in those two books, I feel like there's still a great deal of mystery about how ordinary people go on to commit crimes and whether they were ever ordinary to begin with. So I was interested to see how Endō would handle that topic. The Sea and Poison starts with a pretty traditional frame story. You've got this middle-aged man, the narrator, who moves to a suburb of Tokyo with his wife. And this suburb is basically a small town in and of itself, and like a small town, there are not a lot of options, so there's only one doctor, a doctor named Suguro. Like most people, when you get to a new town, you want to find a doctor, so this middle-aged man has a condition where he needs regular treatments, so he goes to this doctor. What he notices is that Suguro is a very efficient physician, but he has zero bedside manner. As the story goes on, we learn that Suguro was involved with human experimentation during the war, and that was about 2 decades ago. And then the book moves from the present day back to when Suguro was a young man. There's a series of flashbacks, actually, which cover different perspectives of people involved in a specific experiment involving an American prisoner of war. So that is how the story is set up. And something that's kind of interesting about this is that the frame story starts us off in the book, but as the book progresses, the frame story basically vanishes, and by the end of the book, we are still stuck in the past. I think that's a very effective literary device, starting out with half of a frame story, but not finishing with one, and I don't know that I've ever read a book like that before, but it definitely drives home the point that the past is still tied to the present. There's this sort of sense that, in a way, there's no time. There's only what you have done and who you are today, and what are you doing about what you did 20 years ago. That's kind of the effect that this device has in this story, so I thought that was an interesting technique. Like I said earlier, one of the main reasons I wanted to read this book was to understand or to see what Endō thought of how someone would become so evil, and what did they do to get to that point. To name some of the things they did, which we have from first-hand accounts and confessions by some of the people that did these things. They would infect people with diseases, they would do amputations, they would remove organs from these people, and sometimes they would do these things without any anesthesia, purportedly to prevent the anesthesia from having any effects upon the bodies of these victims. And the overarching goal here was to do experimentations on humans to see the effects of biological warfare and biological weapons specifically. At the end of this episode, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I have some links in the show notes that talk about this stuff in somewhat disturbing detail. But that's the kind of thing that this Suguro was involved with. And Endō's premise in this book is that, indeed, ordinary people who are outwardly very average did participate in these actions. So he covers the lives of 3 of these people. Each one has their own weakness, which seems to have led them down this path. So going back to Suguro's early adulthood and his the beginnings of his career, he was an intern at this hospital. And there was another intern there, a guy named Toda, and we get a flashback showing Toda's life from boyhood and how he ended up in the place that he is. And from a young age, Toda was a very selfish child. He was apathetic to the distress of others, and he had a life of privilege, which he abused in many different ways. He spent his whole life basically outsmarting the system, like his teachers and other people. So he got away with things his whole life. That's kind of how he became a very cold person and someone who is going to do what he's told when it comes down to it. Another character that Endō shows us is a woman named Ueda, and she's a nurse at this hospital and also gets pulled into this experiment to assist the doctors. She is someone who has suffered a great deal in her life. She has a lot of hatred and bitterness inside of her, especially against her greedy husband. But she also has a lot of hatred against white people. In particular, there's this woman in the hospital named Hilda, and she's the wife of one of the doctors there. And Ueda is jealous of this woman named Hilda, and I think racism plays into Ueda's motivation to participate in the murder of the American prisoner. But not only that, Ueda, in her anger and bitterness, also abuses her own pet dog. Endō says that she gets to a point where she even hits her dog, like physically abuses her dog that way. We've talked before on this podcast about how animal abuse has some links to the abuse of humans, particularly in the Sea Wolf, where we saw Wolf Larsen, the captain of the ship. He was torturing a shark, and he ended up torturing his own men on the ship. So that's an interesting point that Endō makes. And then, apart from racism, Ueda also abuses her servant. She starts hitting her servant out of frustration and anger. Here's a woman who has already physically abused other innocent beings. So for her to assist in this operation is essentially the next level of the expression of her hatred and the expression of the racist feelings she has against whites. Finally, we come to Suguro, who is our main character and also an intern at the time that this happened. Suguro is, I think, meant to represent the very most average person He doesn't have a dark or disturbing past. He didn't suffer greatly as a child, and he's not particularly privileged or otherwise in a position to abuse others. But he ends up succumbing to peer pressure, and this is something that most people are more likely to be vulnerable to than some of the other stumbling blocks that Toda, the other intern, and Ueda, the nurse, succumbed to. Not only that, but Suguro has a lot of fear inside of him. There is this one patient in the hospital, this old lady who Suguro has been caring for very carefully, and then at one point he kind of snaps and he just lashes out and hits her. And what that really is, I think, is a moment of fear. And this all culminates in a moment when he is surrounded by Japanese soldiers who are expecting him to participate in these atrocities, and they just start laughing, just making light of the situation. And I was reminded of a scene in That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis, a book that I, if you'll remember, did not enjoy. But there was a scene where the organization, the sinister organization, the members of this club were basically laughing, and the normal character named Mark, he just was sort of swept up in their laughter. I see the same thing happening here with Suguro, and it's interesting that both books are from roughly the same era, but I think it's something we can take heed of today. If you think about the times that you've felt pressured to do something, chances are people were laughing about it if it was something that you shouldn't have done. And when you feel like you could be the target of laughter, you do tend to bend under peer pressure if that is something which you're faced with, especially on a daily basis. So Suguro is an average person. He's not a key figure in this whole event, but from a societal and a moral standpoint, he is essentially an accomplice. And to that point, the linchpin to this theme that an ordinary person can do great evil, that is all underlined at the beginning of the book, interestingly enough. And this is when our main narrator, not Suguro, but the middle-aged man, he's at the bathhouse in this new town, and he meets a veteran, and the veteran soldier is boasting to him about the women he raped and the men he killed in the Nanjing massacre in China. And this veteran tells him that there's another man in town, a shopkeeper, who did the same things. And he's talking about it very casually at this bathhouse. So not only is the whole book foreshadowed by that moment, but it's really a sample, if you will, of a greater theme, which Endo goes into in disturbing detail in the rest of the book. As you read The Sea and Poison, and especially as you come to the end of the book, you're going to ask yourself, is there any hope in this story? Is there anything greater to look for in this book, or is it all about the evil that humans can stoop to and which continue to do so to this day in various parts of the world? To that, I can only say that part 2 of the book is titled Those to be Judged, and this part is that which covers the flashbacks and how these 3 characters ended up participating in a horrific murder. And to understand the title, Those to be Judged, you have to look at the aftermath of what really happened in history. Many of the human experiments which the Japanese committed during World War II were done in this military unit called Unit 731. And you might think that after the war, all of those people were put on trial and either executed or went to prison. Well, imagine if you can, that there were never any Nuremberg trials, so to speak, for these doctors. That is essentially what happened. There is also substantial documentation to suggest that the United States decided to let these doctors go in exchange for the results of these experiments, the data that they collected from torturing and murdering these prisoners. Well, first of all, that is not something to say lightly, right? I think that sources are extremely important here, and I always try to seek my information from reputable newspapers and academic publications. So please don't take what I just said at face value. I did add some links to articles on my show notes that go into this in detail, and they have the relevant documents which very strongly suggest this is true. It's really mind-boggling to think about, and when I read that, because I didn't know this piece of it, when I read that, it took me a few days to process that. I'm just astounded that anyone could have covered this up. So I go back to Endō's title, Those to be Judged, and I go back to his background as someone who grew up Catholic, and I think that what he's getting at here is these people are going to be judged someday, and it's not for us to say, for example, whether Suguro is to be condemned or not, but someday they will be judged, and perfect justice will be accomplished for these victims. And to underline that, there's many references in the book to a sense of shame and fear, and even penitence. So I did find some hope in this book at the end, in spite of the bleak subject matter. But once again, as far as a cover-up goes, I think it's quite telling that this book was published in Japan in 1958, but we didn't really start talking about it in the United States, in the West, until a couple of decades later. I think that says something right there, and it's hard to think that actually is true. But the important thing is not now whether it was covered up or not. The important thing is that the truth is out there, and we can look at the past with more perspective because of it.